Welcome to part two. I'm Russell Muirhead, talking with you today about Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, and his account of the plague of Athens that came to devastate Athens in the second year of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, as I said in part one, is described by us as a realist. Let me just turn very briefly to Thucydides' own description of what he's doing at the very beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And I'm reading from this fantastic edition by Robert Stroessler, which is full of wonderful maps and footnotes, and is a nice translation. Thucydides says that with reference, he says, there's a lot of speeches that he gives, sort of diplomatic speeches of different city-states in Greece, negotiating with Athens as Athens is extending its empire, for instance, or as Athens is prosecuting its war against the allies of Sparta and its allies. There are speeches that are made back and forth. He says, with reference to the speeches in this history, some were delivered before the war began, others while it was going on. Some I heard myself, others I got from various quarters. It was, in all cases, difficult to carry them word for word in one's memory. So my habit has been to make the speakers say what was, in my opinion, demanded of them by the various occasions. Of course, adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what they really said. And with reference to the narrative of events, far from permitting myself to derive it from the first source that came to hand, I did not even trust my own impressions, Thucydides says. Didn't even trust his own witnessing. It rests partly on what I saw myself, partly on what others saw for me. The accuracy of the report always been tried by the most severe and detailed tests possible. My conclusions have cost me some labor from the absence of coincidence between accounts of the same events by different eyewitnesses. This variation arises from imperfect memory, from partiality from one side or the other. The absence of romance, he says, in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest. But if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the understanding of the future, which in the course of human things must resemble, if it does not reflect it, I shall be content. I have written my work not as an essay which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. How's that for ambition? I've written this not for you, but for all posterity. Will it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past? It won't be judged entertaining, welcoming, desirable, attractive by those who want a romantic history. It won't be judged well by those who want to see the good triumph, the wicked fall. If you want a morality tale, look somewhere else. If you can't take it, if you can't take the way the world really is, and the way the world really is not always kind to the good. If you can't take it, don't read this. Thucydides is not for you. Thucydides is for those who desire an exact knowledge of the past so they can understand the future, which will in certain ways resemble the past. So if you want to understand where we are now, read Thucydides. If you can take the truth about human things, read Thucydides. If you can't, move on. Move on. It's not going to be satisfying. There's something about it that might even be disturbing, and that's what we left off with last time. So let me turn now to Thucydides' account of the plague. It comes at the beginning of as I said, Book 2, after the war has just been fought for about a year. I think at the beginning of the second year of the war. And you'll be grateful if you've actually done the reading that it doesn't take much time to do. It's only a page or two that Thucydides needs to describe the plague. Thucydides' account of the plague comes immediately after his account of Pericles' funeral oration, a great and famous speech by this great Athenian general to the Athenians, honoring the war dead, those who died in this very, very first phase of what became a very, very long war. Pericles gives this oration that is customary to give in Athens, honoring the war dead, but he gives it in a very unconventional way. And instead of discussing those who died and their exploits and their virtues and their courage, he talks about what they died for, Athens. He extols Athens. The funeral oration is this kind of zenith of civic pride, Athenian civic pride. The speech, by the way, comes to be kind of a template, it's argued, for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And it's almost as if no sooner has Pericles finished this speech than the plague happens. Pericles extols the Athenians for their wonderful city, for their form of government, for their mode of politics, for the shape they gave their own city, a democracy. He extols it for its openness to outsiders. It's a trading city with this great port, Piraeus. He extols it for its freedom, both public and private. He celebrates Athenian virtue, the virtues of lawfulness and courage. And no sooner has he finished this and exhorted his listeners to honor the dead by serving this great city just as they did. No sooner has he finished that than this unthinkable plague appears in the city. We think now that among its causes were the fact that many Athenians had crowded within the walls of Athens. Athens, of course, was a naval power fighting a land power, Sparta, and it was vulnerable to being attacked by land. So one way to defend itself was to move the population inside the walls. They could get their food from boats. They didn't need to farm land just outside the walls, and thus defend themselves against a Spartan attack. But that crowding inside the walls led to very unhygienic conditions that created an occasion for this great and mysterious disease. Thucydides says there was no ostensible cause that they could put their finger on, but people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head, redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts, such as the throat or the tongue, becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain soon reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind, named by physicians, ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, also, an ineffectual retching followed, producing violent spasms, which in some cases ceased soon after, in others much later. Externally, the body was not very hot to the touch nor pale, but reddish, livid, breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. Internally, though, it burned so much that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen, even of the very lightest description. What they would have liked best would have been to throw themselves into cold water, as indeed was done by some of the neglected sick who plunged into wells in their agonies of unquenchable thirst, though it made no difference whether they drank little or much. Besides this, the miserable feeling of not being able to rest or sleep never ceased to torment them. He goes on to describe the symptoms that followed still, such as diarrhea, neurological problems, others seized with an entire loss of memory on their first recovery and did not know either themselves or their friends. People losing extremities, fingers, toes. Truly horrible, horrific disease. And he describes how it punished the good, the decent. And besides that, there was the awful spectacle of men dying like sheep through having caught the infection and nursing each other. This caused the greatest mortality, Thucydides says. On the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. On the other, if they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. This was especially the case with such as made any pretensions to goodness. Honor made them unsparing of themselves in their attendance in their friends' houses. So the good died most of all. Goodness was punished by the plague, as the bodies of the dead piled up on top of each other everywhere, as Thucydides describes, leading ultimately to a kind of lawless extravagance. And this is the last bit that I'm going to read from Thucydides' description. Men now did just what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a corner. Perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none. So it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contributed to it was both honorable and useful. Fear of the gods or law of men, there was none to restrain them. Such was the nature of the calamity, and heavily did it weigh on the Athenians. Death raging within the city, and devastation without. This is the passage that the author of the Atlantic Peace, Catherine Kalidis, this is the passage that she fixes on, the way that lawlessness reigned. And in her reading, the plague revealed to Athenians what they really were. They weren't really decent people. They weren't really lovers of the law or lawful. They weren't really people who feared and honored the gods or pursued honor themselves. They were really people who loved pleasure, who loved the pleasure of the moment. They were really hedonists, and the plague revealed that to themselves. And in a way, she says that they could never forget, and with a consequence that would be fatal for Athenian democracy. What will this pandemic reveal to us about ourselves? She asks. Will we pass the test that they failed? I think that is a misread. And in part 3, I'm going to try to explain why.